So today we're lucky to have Senator Rhiannon, got a fire alarm going off. From the Greens, Dennis McNamara, who's a CFMEU delegate, and Jean from Solidarity, an activist with us. So we're going to start, welcome Lee, and we'll have the speakers all give a talk, have a chat, and then come back for 5 minutes at the end for them to respond to questions and so forth. Alright, talk away, Lee.
Acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, pay tribute to their history, their culture, and their ongoing contributions to our community. And on behalf of the Greens, thanks very much for the invitation to speak. Been asked to speak about dissecting the election and what's ahead for the left and now social movements. So to start off just by a bit of dissecting, numbers is probably a good place to start, and the numbers I think are interesting and give us an idea of what's gone down, because what we saw is that a quarter of the Australians who voted in the election did not vote for Labor, Liberal or the Nationals. And we know that they're not all on the progressive side of politics, but I personally always think anything that helps break down the two-party system is good. Obviously, I'm being careful what I'm saying about cancer there, but still, breaking down the two-party system I think is incredibly important. And those figures, it's not certainly increased by a considerable amount this time, but we've seen that trend particularly since about 1998 coming through. Then votes with Labor and the Coalition, their votes were down. I think Labor had their lowest vote since the 1940s, and also Morrison on the night of the election was sort of shortly about that, and then somebody pointed out to him that their vote was the lowest it's been for a long time too. With regard to the Greens, it was Greens from Centrefold. We went up a little bit. We went up 1.6% in the House of Reps, not so good in the Senate. What I did want to just speak about, because it's been in the news a bit, and happy to take questions on it, although I think it would be useful to get on where we're actually going. But it is actually quite informative to our tactics, is the issue of the Greens vote in Victoria and New South Wales, because it's been presented for New South Wales, a bit of a basket case, doesn't have the vote Victoria does. Now, you could actually say that about quite a few things on the left, because probably those of you who are around my age, you would remember that in Victoria, the progressive movement regularly beats us when it comes to having protests. I can only remember one protest, and that was in 1995, the action against French tests. When we got a bigger turnout than Victoria did, and why that was because Triple M was actually backing they had a thing against the French for some reason, and they came out against the French tests, and we got a huge turnout. So it's very interesting that the political movement in Victoria is much more progressive. You see it in the Labor Party, you see it in social movements, you see it in the unions, and it plays out on election day very, very much so. And in New South Wales, when it comes to election time, we have some big challenges. We're a third of the country. Our New South Wales Greens is running a campaign for a third of the country. And we have some challenging constituencies: Western Sydney, Western New South Wales, and the ethnic communities. Now, within all those, we're doing work. We're not just out there to work in places to get votes. We work there because we think that's part of our work. You would have seen our work, well, you may have, around issues to do with farming and coal mining, and much more, particularly also around regional services in country areas. In Western New South Wales, our work is becoming more extensive, and to give you some examples that while our vote was down in some areas, where we had concentrating, very directed campaigning, that you could see when you start looking at the booths, an increase. So one example from Blacktown, where we did a very targeted campaign around getting lifts on the railway station around that area where we worked very intensely, there was, booth by booth, an increase in votes. And we saw this in different areas. Another area was with regard to Wollongong. Wollongong, seat of Cunningham. The northern part of the electorate is much higher levels of education, higher income. Southern part is around Port Kembla, part of one of the most depressed areas in the whole country. And their very strong campaign over a long period, initiated by the unfortunately sadly deceased MP John Kay, around the steel industry. Close work with the AWU. I think when a lot of people hear the AWU, they think of Shorten. The AWU in Port Kembla, in Wollongong, has traditionally been a very strong membership-based union. We work with the AWU, South Coast Labour Council, and doing a whole lot of on-the-ground work. And that has really played out in some fantastic work. We've got a bill going through Parliament about procuring steel locally, which if that was done at a local government level, state government, federal level, it would ensure that we had a steel industry in Australia, that there was as jobs growth, and that these communities like Whyalla and Port Kembla had a much healthier future. And again, big increases in that area, around 5%. And there's other examples of that around the place. But just to move on, the other aspects that I want to, just in terms of still staying with dissection, is the issue with labour. And this, I think, in the discussion and certainly my contribution, I just want to give time to this. Dealing with labour on the left has been a challenge for 100 years. Like quite serious. When they're in opposition, they're a different beast. When they're in government, and more so, neoliberal, moving over to the other side. Still in opposition, they do some pretty bad things, but this election, like we've just got to acknowledge, on negative, they either neutralise their bad policies, or they're out there saying things like, they have their strategy, their people's first strategy, out there talking about the, big banks and, sort of redirecting money, redistributing wealth. And I think that we've got to acknowledge that. And I find this something that the left, when I look at the history of the left, I'm very interested in the history of our movement in this country. You see that in dealing with Labor, that we fluctuate from being sectarian to being too wishy-washy. Trying to work it out in the middle is very hard. So just to remind ourselves of how Labor played at this time, like issues around West Connects, which, that's Labor's baby, that moment, let's remember. But Albanese largely neutralised the damage that project should have done to the Labor vote. Now, there were some pockets of Greenville that I acknowledge that where there was the intensive work that was done, people were already pretty cluey to the history of this project, that Albanese wasn't so successful in Commonwealth. But that certainly played, that was certainly an area that largely I would argue that they neutralised. Then there was an extraordinary statement from Plibersek saying that the Greens were dangerous ideologues that will keep Labor out of power for a decade. Then there was all those lies that they perpetuated for weeks, and I'll be frank, I don't think that we answered it sufficiently loud enough and consistently, and that was regard to this, the rubbish around a Greens Liberal preference deal. And that doesn't stand. Why do they go on with that? Because they know. Why does Labor go on about that? They know that our voters, our potential voters, don't want the thought of us hanging out with a coalition. Why would you? And that's the way you can scare voters back to Labor. But just having said that, what we need to always remember, and I'm sure we do, is how often Labor are sitting there with a coalition doing some really bad things. And just to remember them around their asylum seekers, that they're still there, that they voted to jail journalists and whistleblowers for up to 10 years for public interest disclosures. With regard to mandamus surveillance, they're sitting there with the coalition. So much of the whole defence budget with these jet strike fighters, that they just sign off on that immediately. And then the whole story of free trade agreements. And when it comes to the ABCC, remember, they took so long to repeal that, and they never repealed it fully. So I'm not letting Labor off the hook, I'm just trying to say how they're presenting themselves and the challenges that we have. And just before I leave Labor, they look as though they're now to do another rotten thing with the coalition. We've seen Dreyfus out there in recent days talking about how people who are convicted of terrorism, when their time is up, when their time in jail is up, they can still be retained in jail. And Dreyfus has talked about bipartisan support. He said he was encouraged by the approach of government on the national post-sentence detention. So again, you see where Labor sit on a lot of these things, but how they're presenting themselves to most people is quite different. Then just some comments about Hanson. The rise of Hanson is obviously a huge challenge. When you...
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Sorry about that. I wasn't sure. Okay, so about the rise of Hanson. But the Coalition and Labor have need to bear a huge responsibility in terms of how this, how One Nation rose. If you go back to 1996 when she's elected, Howard would never condemn what she had to say. And Labor were pretty weak on it too. Right now, just fast tracking because of time, this debate and campaign up in Cessnock, where there was an application to set up a mosque. Labor was shocking on that. Labor didn't come out and using racist terms, but what they were doing was talking about traffic problems, community safety, just a subtext for encouragement of people who are the racists who have got caught up in that whole issue. So because of shortness of time, I'll leave that one, but it's something that we need to deal with. With regard to the future, I actually think that where the left movement is well positioned to have a much stronger, how would I put it? The climate and the understanding of the need to have policies that address people's needs in terms of secure work, housing, issues to do with their education, things that matter to them, is very strong now. I think, and this is certainly within the Greens, as we're dissecting where we're going, that we're looking at is the need to, we've done it in the past, but I think we can do more, amplifying our voice around free higher education, free education across the board, in terms of issues to do with public services. One issue with regard to climate change is interesting, that while that movement has been very strong, I think what needs to be much stronger now is for greater public intervention, more that we're right to be borrowing money to fast track the climate change and to be talking about unionised workforces. Because at the present time, those aspects have really rarely come into the climate change debate. But overall, I think that it's addressing people's needs and highlighting that through more funding for public services is what's absolutely critical. And within that, when we're talking about funding private services, it's also about taking on the privatisation agenda of both Labor and the Coalition, which more people are getting cluey to. And I think that often we don't acknowledge the successes that the movement has. Because at the moment, while privatisation remains rife in terms of the policies of Labor, Liberal and Nationals, you won't see them using that word anymore. And why don't they use it? Because they know it's unpopular. They know that people are becoming concerned about that. So I think it's a reminder for us that there is a growing understanding that there are certain public services that need to be in public hands. And it occurred to me this week with all that debate around energy, we could have been out there, and I think should have been out there, about talking about the need to nationalise our energy industry when there's all this debate going on about who should buy it. And that's where we need to be advancing those policies and giving that leadership around the public ownership of public services, that we are a rich country, that we can afford to deliver these services to reduce inequality, to reduce disadvantage from Indigenous communities, refugee and asylum seeker communities across to everybody who is in this country, and also addressing our aid programs overseas. So we are a rich country. If we close the tax loopholes, really go after the big banks, getting the fairer taxation system right across the board, the money is there. We can achieve these, and I think bringing these messages together is the way that we can build a much stronger movement on the left. These are some of the debates that we're having in the Greens, and I look forward to the discussion here. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Lee. So next up we've got Dennis, and I'm just going to try and make this microphone do something.
You don't need to.
It's too loud, that's alright.
Yeah, good morning people. I'm Dennis McNamara. I'm a delegate with the CFMEU. I'm also on the Unions Committee of Management, and I'm a delegate to the National Conference. Talking today about what we do after the election. I'll explain a little bit about the ABCC first, because I believe not everyone understands it fully, and the thing that struck me the most was the election was called on the ABCC legislation. That's why he called the election. That's why there was a double dissolution. It was that important to get this legislation through Parliament that he had to call an election on it at both houses. And I found it amazing that throughout the whole campaign, it wasn't mentioned once. I heard it mentioned once when Bill Shorten was being questioned, and there was a woman there that owned a building company, and she asked why he wouldn't support it. That was the only time I heard it mentioned in the whole campaign. So it astounds me that something of that importance didn't rate a mention. The ABCC has never gone away. Lee was right. All the Labor Party did under Julia Gillard was change the name to the Fair Work Building Commission and took away the coercive powers. So years ago we had the coercive powers where we could be fined, we could be interrogated for having a union meeting on site, we could be hauled in and questioned, and if we didn't answer those questions, there was only one punishment for us, and that was 6 months jail. They want to bring back those same coercive powers, and that's why we believe it's important that we defend it. But like I said, it never ever went away. It's still been kept there, and it was kept there by the Labor Party because they wanted what they called at the time a tough cop on the beat, because they consider construction workers to be too militant, and that we need a separate entity to look after us than anybody else does in Australian society. So, you know, our argument has always been that, you know, as a delegate or a site delegate, I can call a meeting on site, and then I can be questioned about that. Or anyone else can be questioned on site. What did Dennis say at the meeting? And if they don't answer the question. But I can walk around the corner and murder somebody, and then when I'm arrested, I've got the right to silence. I can sit in there and not answer their interrogation. But because I'm a building worker and I've spoke on a site, I don't have that right anymore. Or if that legislation's passed, I won't have that right anymore. Now, like I said, we've worked under it where that was already there, and it didn't change the way we did things. Because if there's a bad law, we don't believe in it, and we just fight on regardless. And we'll continue to do that. But same with political parties. Like, you know, after the election, our struggle doesn't change no matter who gets elected, because nothing has ever been won in the talking shop of Parliament. Conditions in our industry and every other are won on the job, on the site, in the factories, in the workplaces, through struggle, not through people sitting in a room talking about what they believe our best interests are. So we don't really care, or, you know, I don't care myself personally. My union might have a different take on it, but it doesn't bother me which party gets into Parliament, because the struggle's going to continue no matter who's in there. Some of them enter in there with the best intentions, and when they get elected, they seem to forget where they come from, and they forget those intentions. and they just feed at the trough that's there, and it is a massive trough that they feed out of. But like I said, so we don't change. Our struggle doesn't change, and our tactics don't change. We just continue to fight on the job every day, and that's how we've won all of our conditions that we have. And the reason we're targeted the most is because we've got good conditions at work. We get paid well for doing hard work, but it is hard work we do. We work in all the elements. When it's in summer, it's stinking hot, and we're out there working in it. When it's in winter, it's freezing cold, and we're out there working in it. And it's an unsafe industry that we work in. It's one of the most unsafe in Australia. Our figures are, one construction worker in Australia dies every week in Australia. Dies. And that's every week. Now, under the ABCC, those deaths increased. And safety on jobs increased. Now, these were people that were supposed to be brought in to protect our industry and to protect the people in it. So there's a few myths that they have in regards to the ABCC, and I'll tell you one of them, that there's been no increase in workplace disputes since the ABCC was abolished. Sorry, that there has been an increase since it was abolished. And the figures released by the ABS clearly show that since the ABCC was abolished in 2012, industrial disputes fell by 65%. So we were on strike far more when they were in power, or when they had their coercive powers, than we have been since they've not been there. Because our struggle increases. Because their whole role is to try and keep the union off the job. Yeah? They stop our organisers from coming on site, and they stop us from having meetings on site, even over safety or anything else. So the facts show that when they're in power, we go on strike more, because we struggle more against them. And that's what happens with the working class. The more oppressed they become, the more they struggle and fight back. And sometimes, I remember a few years ago when John Howard got beat, I was hoping he won, because I wanted the attacks that he was going to put on the working class. Because as Australians and working class, we're very apathetic, and we just allow things to happen. And then the Labor Party get in and we say, well, they're not too bad. Some of the worst legislation in this country was passed under the Labor Party. Anti-worker legislation, because we allow it. Because we say the Labor Party's the workers' party. They can't be too bad. They're passing it. They're not the workers' party, and they haven't been for a long, long time. Nobody in there is in there to represent the beliefs or the struggles of the working people. So, look, what I wanted to say is, well, in the campaign, in the union campaign, we decided this time, as our union, to not back a political party. We just said we're sick of giving money to people that get in there and won't help us out. So we ran our own union campaign, and we called it Put the Liberals Last. So we told them, we don't care who else you vote for, just vote for the Liberal Party last. And some people might say that's extreme, or it's not a good idea because you get all these other parties in place, but that was how we were looking at it. They were the worst ones for us, so our argument was put them last. But we weren't going to come out and say we're backing the Labor Party, because they don't do anything for us either. So that's the situation we find ourselves in. But in regards to a union, and you saw all the ads on the TV, I don't know if any of you saw the real tradie ad or the fake trade, whatever it was. We put out an ad after that, filmed it on the site I work on, and it was called Real Tradies. And it was just filmed on a building site with building workers holding up placards. That cost us $1,000 to make. And it shown on the TV while the State of Origin was on, 500,000 hits on YouTube or whatever that was. But it just shows what you can put out there with very little amount of money and very little fuss. Because it was real. It was real building workers with what they were concerned about, holding it up on a piece of cardboard written with text up. And it was a very emotional ad. So if you do get a chance, have a look at it. But as far as, like I said, the union, I'm focusing on the union a lot, guys, because that's the people I represent. And I represent building workers on site every day of the week. And so I'm focusing on that. And like I said earlier, We're not looking too much at the political parties because we don't trust any of them in there. What we want and what we believe the left should be looking at is an alternative to politics, an alternative to the parliamentary system, because there's never any change, positive change in it for us working people. So these are the discussions we need to be having, I believe. Not what we do with what political party is in power, what we do to get rid of the parliamentary system. They're the questions we need to be asking ourselves, and the questions we need to be asking our leaders. Because that's the only thing that's going to change this country, is real struggle, dare I say revolution, and revolutionary struggle. And that doesn't happen through politics, or through sitting around talking about it. So that's what we need to be putting back in our workplaces. A lot of you people here are educated people, you're students and so forth. We need your thoughts on it, on how we achieve that. We're happy to do the hard labour and stand there on the picket lines and do the fighting and the gluing. That's what we're good at. But we need you lot to come up with the good ideas to do it. But like I said, let's stop thinking about how we get a political party to do what we wish, and let's work out how we get rid of them altogether and we change that struggle and we take Australia forward for the working people. That's what I Lee showed me a thing just when we were talking before about the green beans, and that's something our union has a proud history of, and we just put one on the Bondi Pavilion, and we do because we believe, and if you go down the rocks are there because of the BLF green beans. That's the only reason they're there, because workers at the time, and with a green bean, what some people don't understand, they put a green bean on. What that in effect does is puts us out of work. Because they wanted to demolish the rocks and build huge skyscrapers, which would have employed all of us. So we took a decision to put our own members out of a job because we believe that some things should stay the way they are, instead of just having high-rise all through the city. And Kelly's Bush was the first one we put in place. And we've done them selectively over the years. Because what our concern is, we get asked every week to put one on, but our concern is that we don't lose the power of them. Because it's all right us sitting in a room as a community management saying, yeah, we put a green bean on there, but if nobody's prepared to stand up and link arms when the bulldozers come, then there's no point. So unless we're prepared to defend it, we don't put the green bean in place. So with the likes of the Bondi Pavilion, we'll be down there picketing if they try and knock that place down or do any damage to it. But again, that struggle that's taken place within our industry. But it's also social issues. Our union has a proud history of being involved in social issues. And that's what the governments don't like. They don't like a union that involves themselves in social politics or social issues that affect people outside of the workers that they represent. And our union has a proud history of it. We're looking at merging with the MUA in the future, which is another positive thing for the union movement. I consider us probably the most militant and the MUA on par with us. And we're both always under attack, so we sat out and said, well, we may as well be under attack together instead of separately. But they've now come out and they're opposing that. Michaela Cash has come out and said there should be a law put in place that doesn't allow us to merge with the MUA because it's against public interest. It's against public interest for us to merge. And she said they've got laws to stop massive companies merging if it's against public interest, so they should have laws to stop unions from merging if it's against public interest. Well, I ask you, when have they ever stopped any two companies from merging when it affected public interest? I can't remember any. So it seems when a union want to do the same and become bigger and stronger, then we should have laws to stop it from happening. So we'll achieve that merge. It'll take a fair amount of time, but we will achieve it, and I believe we'll come through a bigger, stronger union. For political organisation or education, there's no one better than the MUA. They have a fantastic program of educating their members, their organisers. They've got a centre down the coast where they actually go. You can stay down there and they run seminars, and it's a fantastic program. And it's something that's lacking in the trade union movement today, is political education. You know, we've got members of our own, even officials of our own, that vote for the Liberal Party. I dare say there's people there that voted for Pauline Hanson. Yep. So I believe it's imperative for us to organise education within ourselves. You know, I've come through the industry. I'm only 47 years old, but I've been working in the building game since I was 14. And I was educated on the job, in the smoko sheds, by the old blokes that sat in there. There was nothing else discussed at work, at lunch and smoko, other than how they won the conditions that we enjoyed. You knew how long they'd been on strike to get smoko sheds, how long they were on strike to get toilets, how many weeks they were out to get workers' comp, and things that everyone in Australia enjoys. Long service leave, superannuation. We won superannuation for the working people, the building unions. At that time, only bankers and high rollers got super. They told us we'd never achieve it. You can't have superannuation. You're in an industry that moves around all the time. We gave away a wage rise for super. And then, over the years, now they've made it law, and everybody gets super. So these are conditions that we've won through struggle. And again, that brings me back to the point I started with. Nothing has ever been won without struggle on the job. And nothing will ever be won without struggle on the job. So don't have much faith in the politics or the parliamentary, no offence to yourself, Lee, but politicians aren't there to represent the working people. That's all I'll say.
Thanks. I wanted to start with two stats that came out during the week. The first one was the Commonwealth Bank's record $9.5 billion profit that they made. The second one was a survey of household financial security that showed that 29% of Australian incomes dropped, family incomes dropped during the last year. We now live in a country where the 10 richest households have the same wealth as the poorest 3.9 million people. We live in a grossly unequal society, and it's getting worse. And we know very well that this reality is not an accident. It's the product of very distinct government policies over the period of at least 35 years, where, you know, the kind of neoliberal trickle-down economics has meant that governments of both sides of politics have cut the corporate tax rate and deliberately shifted the welfare state from servicing, you know, the interests of ordinary working people towards the interests of, you know, the people running the public-private partnerships, the bosses and the rich. And there was a really good example of that. You know, some of those neoliberal policy chickens coming home to roost this week with the scandal at the ABS with the census. You know, the truth is the ABS has been hacked. It was hacked. It was hacked by the $68 billion, million dollar efficiency dividend that both Rudd and Abbott cut out of the ABS, you know, for years. And by the fact that they privatised the IT system of the ABS, which is exactly what they want to do to Medicare. You know, we in Australia are the victims of denial of service attacks. The people orchestrating those are not in Beijing, they're in Canberra, they're in Macquarie Street. You know, we've had decades and decades of money pulled out of TAFE, pulled out of universities, pulled out of hospitals, pulled out of Aboriginal communities. And I think this sort of package of, neoliberal cuts, austerity for us, tax cuts for the rich. If we look around the world, we can see again and again that people reject it, and every time governments stand up for that, people vote very hard against it. And I think, last year, I think it was just after Keep left last year, that Abbott was thrown, stabbed in the back, and we got the Turnbull Prime Ministership. And I think it's worth remembering back the kind of fear and horror that a lot of people in the left had with this idea that, oh my God, we've lost the terrible figure of Abbott, Turnbull's going to sort of win elections for here to kingdom come. The fact is, we really need to look at what's happened to Turnbull. He, his legacy is about the fact that standing for exactly the same recipe of service cuts and austerity for us and tax cuts for the rich, his popularity has crashed and burnt quite spectacularly. And you think about the goals that he set for the 2016 election. He wanted to clean out the Senate that had been such an obstacle when it came to the budget measures that Abbott and co wanted to put in after the 2014 budget. He wanted to get some kind of political mandate that would allow the government to refresh its agenda and actually do business that the rich want. And he wanted to put the Abbott faction in the Liberal Party, the hard right, to bed quite decisively. And look at what we've got after this election. The Senate is just an absolute quagmire for the government. What possibly is the electoral mandate of the Turnbull government? What is he going to do? Nobody even knows. And he's got a parliamentary majority so thin that if one MP goes to the toilet, they're going to lose a vote. And I think there's a few things in the last week where we can see the vulnerability of Turnbull. The fact that the Abbott people are actually riding high. Look at what happened with the discussion about whether they were going to send Rudd to the UN. Actually we see again it's the Abbott forces which are actually the guiding hand in the Turnbull government. Equally, the question about George Christensen's, crossing the floor over superannuation. So we've got this quite incredible situation with Turnbull, and it reminds me a lot of the, what's happened with the UK Tory Prime Minister, David Cameron. He's been forced to resign after the Brexit vote, which was a referendum that he called. Before the last general election, he set up this situation, very, very tricky politics about, we're going to play off the Eurosceptic right within the Tories and UKIP, and we're going to ride to power and kind of consolidate our agenda, was what he thought. But, the Brexit vote represented 17 million British people telling the establishment and the Tories that have driven through those cuts to get stuffed, and now Cameron has resigned over it. He's gone, his political history. I think the truth is we need to understand that the Australian election here has seen the same dynamic where people have voted in their millions against the Liberals. Now Turnbull has just hung on, but the truth is he's a dead man walking, and we really need to understand that. He's just scraped through and people have voted massively against the Liberals. But it's really, really important to understand, I think there's again similar dynamic with the Brexit vote, that people can vote against the establishment, but that doesn't mean they're voting clearly to the left. This is, I think, what we need to understand with the Australian election. People have voted against the Liberals, but the vote hasn't gone decisively to Labor and to the Greens, and instead we've got this absolute scattergun, which includes the really, really concerning right, racist right, populist of Hanson, as well as Darren Hinch, and a whole scattergun of other people. And I think we need to be clear, it shouldn't be any surprise that the racist right can, get a hearing in a country where, the significant policies of the day see children having their childhood ripped up from them in Nauru, and the same thing, Aboriginal kids in Dondale. Lee mentioned the terror laws where even after people have served their time, they're going to be locked up. There's constant attacks on the Muslim community. It's, mainstream politics has served up this platform on which Hanson has risen, but we can't be at all complacent about what we do about it, because I think it's really, clear in the last week that it is going to really matter the way that Turnbull goes down. Is it going to be a debate, as we've sometimes seen, between Sonia Kruger, Pauline Hanson, about exactly how extreme our Islamophobia should be against Turnbull? Is it going to be, the likes of the people who want to get rid of the 18C legislation debating with the Attorney General? Or I think we saw a slightly different version when we looked at the question of the guy that they tried to head up the Dondale Royal Commission with, that Martin racist judge from the Northern Territory. There you actually saw people saying, we're not going to let this guy, this is a whitewash, we've had it, and the government responded and put in Tom Calma, which is still an attempt to push the issue under the agenda, but I think it gives you a clear sense of, there's a question about what the political debate is in this country, and it's going to really, really matter what we do. So I think the general situation is that Turnbull is extremely weak, but the politics is absolutely going to matter in terms of how this term of Parliament plays out. And I wanted to give two examples of two recent industrial disputes that I think show you exactly why the politics matters. The first one is the Polar Fresh strike that happened in Victoria, where people fighting against casualisation and for wage increases. They're the people who work in the cold food processing that services Coles. 650 workers, down tools, walked off the job. They organised hard pickets where they actually stopped the trucks from coming in and out of the centres. Not only did they picket their own centre, but they picketed the backup distribution centres that Coles had set up to try and get around the strike. Instantly they were putting millions of dollars of produce, this is what Coles went on and on about in their media releases, at risk, and the shelves at Coles emptied. And they won that strike in 3 days. And fantastic, unified, action. I think, unfortunately, the heroic people who are on strike at Carlton United Breweries, the truth is, there's a very, very different strategy at play there. You've got the 55 maintenance workers who've been offered their jobs back if they're on a non-union agreement and only 35% of the pay. They've been forced to sit out there while scabs doing their jobs are bussed into the brewery, and even more disgracefully, where there's hundreds of unionised workers who are going in and out of that workplace every single day. And the way that the union officials talk about this dispute is, we're in a war of attrition. We're going to be here, if it takes till Christmas, we're going to be here. The thing is, that's a very, very dangerous sort of politics, the war of attrition. They could, if they actually shut down that brewery and brought all the other workers out, they'd win that strike just as quickly. The way the Coles, shelves empty, we've got to do that with beer, and that's the politics of what's needed. But I think it's a much bigger symbol. The truth is, we've had years and years of the ACTU policy, and it's going to be a massive question when the Building and Construction Commission comes back, because it looks like they're going to have the numbers to do that. The war of attrition, we are going to wait out the Turnbull government, we're going to box clever, we're going to go under the radar, and eventually we'll get Labor and things will be fixed. That is poison, and the only political force that will benefit out of a war of attrition mentality right now under Turnbull is Hanson. So we've got to make sure that we have the Polar Fresh mentality all out together. We've got to use the strength that we have fundamentally on our side, which is as workers, downing tools, cutting off profits, showing Coles who actually makes their products, who actually cold stores them, who actually facilitates their business. That is the strength on our side that we need to use. Any notion that a war of attrition against Turnbull, will just go under the radar and so on, I think is extremely detrimental. And I think we need to apply this politics to all of the debates that are coming up. The politics around, we're having a session after this about the question of Dondale and the Royal Commission. What is the political debate around that? The question of refugees, the fight at the Sydney College of the Arts, the ABCC. We can't we need to have meetings in hospitals explaining to people why construction workers need to down tools against the ABCC. We have a very, very weak government, but we need the politics in every workplace that can actually unite us, bring our strength together and bring this government down from the left. And I think in that context, it also really, really matters what kind of Greens party we have. As people know, in Solidarity we're revolutionary socialists, and we're not members of the Greens. We were also quite critical of the decision to support the Senate voting legislation in a way that risked the passage of the Building Construction Commission and possibly, relationships with the union. So we have disagreements with the Greens all the time, but we are 100% behind Lee and the New South Wales Greens when they've been attacked by Bob Brown in a disgusting right-wing show that we've seen around the pre-selection that's been going on here in New South Wales, because we know it really, really matters what kind of Greens we have. Do we have the kind of Di Natale, Bob Brown model, which is about we will accommodate our politics to whatever's going to win us the next 5% of votes, and that means we're going to, manage our message from different electorates and basically reflect the way that politics is? Or are we going to have the vision that we've seen from people like Lee, John Kay, who was here speaking at Keep Left last year, who actually understand we need a protest party. We need a party that is going to actually shift fundamentally Australian politics, win people over to our ideas, and that doesn't happen through legislative deals and pragmatism. That happens through action on the streets, organising in workplaces, building the left, building a fighting militant left. So I wanted to conclude by, it's a real honour to speak with both the comrades here today, but it really matters what's going to happen with the Greens, and we are 100% behind the left in New South Wales, which has that activist legacy. But I think more generally, when we look at the political period, it's going to matter what we do. We're a small group here, but everybody in this room needs to see themselves as a little cog that can turn a much bigger political wheel. We need the politics of Polar Fresh in every single dispute. When it comes to how we're going to beat back cancer, how are we dealing with Islamophobia, what's going to happen around the ABCC. We've done some work in the last few years with Unions New South Wales, trying to actually pass motions in different unions, and Dennis was the highlight of that, getting up and challenging Unions New South Wales to actually keep fighting against the Abbott agenda. All those things are really going to matter in this coming period, and it's up to us to continue the level of politics and organisation, so that when we have disputes like Polar Fresh, we can generalise the politics of that and use it to spill out and actually build a strong left that can bring the government down from the left.
Alright, thanks very much to our speakers. So we've got half an hour for discussion and questions now. I encourage anyone who's got a question, a comment, anything to say, just to put your hand up. I'll write you down on a list and point to you when it's your go to speak. So I got one up here.
Okay, my name's Mark Smith, but I live on the Central Coast at the moment, which is a regional area, but it's half city, half region.